Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The 2013 to 2025 Israeli war on Gaza is already being called the worst and most traumatic event in Palestinian history by some scholars, historians, journalists, and many Palestinians too. While we have a ceasefire and some are arguing the new US presidential administration of Donald Trump as being a factor, what has been the last 15 months done for the US reputation as a peace broker in the Middle East? Joining us to explore all of this is Khaled Elgindy. Khaled Elgindy is a visiting scholar at Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He is also the author of a 2019 book, Blind Spot: America, Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. Elgindy previously served as director for Middle Eastern Institute program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs from Jan 2020 to January 2025. From 2010 to 2018, he served as a resident scholar at the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institute. Prior to arriving at Brookings, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on a permanent status negotiation with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and as a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 to 2008. Khaled, welcome to Memo Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
So we obviously now have a ceasefire in Gaza, and what do you feel though thinking about this now? I mean, obviously we can now sort of analyze a bit more about what the meaning of the last 15 months has been. But in your estimation, how do you feel historians will judge US President Joe Biden and his handling of the conflict for the last 15 months?
Yeah, I mean, I've been clear in my criticism of the previous administration of Joe Biden. It, I think, has been a complete failure in almost all of its objectives that it set out after October 7th, with the sole exception of providing Israel with the means to degrade Hamas. Every other aspect of its failure has been, every other aspect of its policy has been a failure. The attempts to mitigate harm to civilians, trying to keep the war from expanding to the rest of the region. Both of those have been a failure. But I think most importantly, it will be remembered as a diplomatic failure. First and foremost, because they spent the last 8 months with the almost identical ceasefire that was signed just a few days ago on the table, and were unable to reach that goal up until the literal last days of the Biden administration. And so there was so much time lost, so much unnecessary death and destruction that followed. This deal could have been had in May had the administration put even moderate pressure on the leadership of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it chose not to. So I think its record will be one of failure.
It's quite interesting to think about this because, of course, over the last year or year and 15 months, we've seen constant reports coming out, sort of leaking out of the administration of Biden's privately trying to push for things, but Netanyahu's not interested. He's personally angry about some of Netanyahu's broken promises. And even in Bob Woodward's book, War, the administration seems to be doing more for a ceasefire, at least in that version of the account. What do you sort of make of all of those reports? Are they to be taken seriously, and how should we sort of understand them?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of motion toward a ceasefire. There was quite a lot of energy spent in the direction of a ceasefire. But the one thing that would have changed Netanyahu's calculations, and that is to pay any kind of cost or possible cost for continuing the war, that's what was missing. And so, all of the Secretary Blinken's shuttle diplomacy, all of the many other, the dozens and dozens of meetings held in Cairo and Doha and elsewhere, weren't going to amount to much if you couldn't change the fundamental calculations that were fueling the continuation of the war. And that had to do with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his need to prolong the war for as much as possible so that he could remain in power. And it took literally a change in presidents. It took the idea of Donald Trump and his unpredictability to change Netanyahu's calculation going forward. He didn't know what to expect, and so there was quite a lot of energy exerted, but it was all for nothing. And most of the analyst community were arguing that you have to put some pressure on Israel. There has to be a cost. There has to be a consequence, and that's the one thing Biden wouldn't do.
And when we sort of think about this current ceasefire, obviously there's a lot of debate right now as to why Israel accepted the ceasefire, and it seems to be obviously the Americans wanted the ceasefire now, but it's not clear whether that's anything to do with the last administration or whether that's because of Trump. Where do you sort of fall on that debate about why Israel accepted the ceasefire, especially when we consider it may not be in Benjamin Netanyahu's actual personal political interest?
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly the Biden administration laid the groundwork. The terms of the deal were there for many, many months. But what wasn't there was the pressure on Israel. Some of the leaks we've seen from Israeli officials right up until the deal was announced was that Trump's team came to town and pretty much told Netanyahu, you have to wrap this up. This war has to be ended before Trump enters office. And that kind of pressure, I think, seems to have been the decisive factor, or at least an important factor. There are other factors like, the Israeli army had been severely fatigued after 15 months. It hadn't achieved most of its goals of completely destroying Hamas. And as a cautionary note, I think it's worth remembering that every Israeli spokesman since this ceasefire was announced has emphasized the idea that this is a temporary ceasefire and that they have every intention of going back and finishing the job and total victory and destroying Hamas. So we're not out of the woods at all. And I think it would be reasonable to expect that Netanyahu will try to test the limits of President Trump in the same way he did President Biden. He's going to see how much he can get away with. And so I think at the first opportunity there is, we could see the Israelis kind of reverse course.
Do you feel it would be easy for them to restart the war? I mean, it's not just the question of the new US administration of Trump. It is also the question of resources that the Israeli military has to sustain another campaign. I mean, the last 15 months, they've seen a huge shortage building up in man supply problems, and part of that caused an issue for Benjamin Netanyahu, as we know, with what's his name gone? The defense minister that resigned in December.
Yoav Gallant.
Gallant, when he resigned, is that something that is reasonable to expect?
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the costs that have acted to kind of constrain Netanyahu, and they're not costs imposed by the United States. So in addition to those, there's also the cost potentially of a public backlash domestically in Israel, because the overwhelming majority of Israelis want to see a deal in which the hostages are released. They are not as committed to perpetual war in Gaza as Netanyahu is. And so that is also a factor that Israelis will be angry if the deal is thwarted and hostages aren't released. So that could be a constraint, but as of now, there are no external constraints.
And before we sort of get onto the question of Biden compared to other US administrations, I do have to ask this, which is that within Israel, at least within certain circles and within the media, there is this feeling that the Gaza war was not a success, that this was a failure. And conversely, we see a lot of obviously Gazans being quite jubilant that this war is now over, at least this phase of it. What's your sort of assessment then about, did Israel win or lose in this war, and was it even a Palestinian victory? What's your feeling about all of this?
Yeah. That's true. I think it's very hard for Netanyahu to declare victory, which is one reason why they're saying we haven't finished the job. We need to go back and do that, and keeping that door open. The reality is that it was never possible to completely eradicate Hamas, and I think every Israeli military and political leader understands this. And so it's really just a pretext for an open-ended forever war that serves Netanyahu's personal interests. And so this is the nature of asymmetrical warfare. As long as the weak side can survive, then they've essentially have a basis to declare victory. And since it was never possible to eradicate Hamas, the Israeli leadership really set itself up for the failure narrative, because that was simply never on the table. And in fact, everything has been destroyed in Gaza except Hamas. Hamas, even their governing capabilities, are still mostly intact. They are the police force, they are the civil defense, they are the basic law and order force inside the Gaza Strip, to the extent that there is any law and order. And so it's very hard for Netanyahu to declare victory given that reality.
So now we turn to sort of Biden in comparison to other US presidents, because this is always an interesting point of to think about, because of course there is this idea, which is not entirely, which is quite accurate in a way, is that the US is very close to Israel, and the US has done quite a lot for Israel in previous administrations as well as the current one. So to your mind, how does Biden compare to previous US presidents, and from what you can tell?
Well, it's no secret that pretty much all US presidents throughout history since 1948 have been fairly strongly pro-Israel. That's even more true after 1967, and even more true in the last 30 years. So we've seen this gradual increase in the extent to which U.S. administrations are kind of supportive of Israel. But even with that, there's no question that Biden stands out in a sort of class of his own. No president has ever been as unconditionally supportive of Israel's actions, given the massive costs on the ground, as Joe Biden. So there were moments of crisis and war and violence and atrocities in the past. For example, in 1982, Ronald Reagan was very critical of the Israeli leadership and threatened to cut military assistance if they didn't constrain the attacks on civilians in their carpet bombing of Beirut. Even after the 9/11 terror attacks in the United States, President George W. Bush also had red lines for then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. There were certain things that he was instructed you cannot do, you cannot go too far. We've never seen this level of violence, and yet the Biden administration, I think one of the key catastrophes very early on in this war, in the fall of 2023, is they openly and explicitly declared that there were no red lines in terms of Israel's conduct, and Israel took that quite to heart. And the Israeli military has engaged in all manner of violations that have, and so we've never seen a president, despite his expressions of frustration, has never done anything meaningful to constrain any of those things that they themselves said they didn't want to see happen, like the restrictions on aid, the attacks on hospitals and civilians, and so forth.
Yes, it's interesting because there was very little constraints, and it was always peculiar to watch because, of course, you're wondering, is there really nothing Israel can do that Biden won't, that Biden will somehow step in, but he didn't, which also brings us back to the question of reputation. Before we sort of get there, why do you feel Biden gave effectively no red lines to Israel? What do you think it was about it that he just refused to do so?
I mean, I think there are a lot of factors: domestic politics. Uh, there are cultural and ideological factors, and I think there are personal factors also for President Biden and people of his generation. But for him in particular, he has a deep sentimental, emotional attachment to Israel, uh, and has described himself as a Zionist. I don't know of any president who has used that expression to describe themselves. And so I think it really boils down to the person of Joe Biden, who was determined that his legacy be that the man who stood by Israel in its greatest moment of need and its greatest most traumatic moment in Israel's history. And he didn't want to do anything that would detract from that narrative and that legacy, even if it meant saving Palestinian lives. And so I think it was so much of it was personal, but a lot of it was political. This was an election year, after all. And even when he expressed frustration with Israel's conduct, he would eventually give Israel a clean bill of health, despite the facts saying otherwise in terms of violations of international law. And so it's really a combination of factors, but it really boils down to the personal psychology of Joe Biden and his deep attachment to Israel.
Yes, and also his complete disregard for Palestinian life. There's
Yeah.
almost a contempt for it. Um, but why do you feel now? Why do you feel America has such a strong attachment to Israel? I mean, I'm looking at this as somebody who studies the histories of empires and all of these sorts of things. And of course, you will find empires attaching themselves to other states abroad. But there's something about this particular relationship which feels it goes beyond national interest. I mean, obviously, national interest is surely part of it, but there's an additional few layers that is sort of hard to justify on national interest grounds.
Yeah, I think that's true. In fact, some of aspects of the relationship kind of undermine U.S. national interests. And U.S. standing, for example, has been severely eroded all over the world, not just in the global South, but even in many Western societies. So I think there are some very deeply rooted kind of cultural and ideological factors. The history of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, not to mention the Bible. These are important cultural and sentimental factors that predispose a great many Americans, and particularly American politicians, to the Zionist project and to being supportive of Israel. Another factor is domestic politics. It's no secret that the pro-Israel lobby, both Jewish groups and Christian evangelical groups, is quite powerful and has enormous influence, particularly in Congress, but also in the media and other kind of cultural institutions. And so you see that particularly in Congress, where members of Congress need, because of the nature of U.S. politics, they rely very heavily on campaign financing from outside pressure groups. And one of the premier groups, or I guess among the premier groups, are the pro-Israel actors in that space, who provide considerable resources to congressional campaigns. And so the combination of these, cultural and ideological forces and domestic politics along with the geopolitical concerns for many in the security and intelligence defense establishment in Washington. Israel is a model for counterterrorism, for counterinsurgency efforts, and so there's great admiration for what Israel has to offer from a technological and logistical and in other ways militarily. And so I think it's all of these factors together that sort of set the United States apart from the rest of even the Western world in its a very strongly pro-Israel political culture.
Could you perhaps now tell us the new Trump administration going forward? What do you think this will mean for Palestinians?
What the war in Gaza will mean?
I mean, so the Trump administration, the fact that we've got a new Trump administration, what will this mean for Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, I think given everything that we've seen and heard so far, it is not looking good for Palestinians. The steps that have been taken, cutting whatever aid may be left to Palestinians, talking about canceling UNRWA, rescinding the micro sanctions on Israeli settlers that the Biden administration imposed, even using terms like Judea and Samaria, which really entails sort of the erasure of Palestinians as a people. All of this does not bode well for Palestinians, and so I think what we're likely to see is the same kind of unconditional military, diplomatic, and other support for Israel, but without the pretense of caring about civilian life or international law or human rights that we heard under the Biden administration. And so, as a practical matter, there won't be a lot of difference between the two administrations in the policies that are pursued on the ground. What will be different is the rhetoric. And so, oddly enough, the Trump's rhetoric will be much more aligned with its actions than the Biden administration, where they talked about international law while at the same time completely eviscerating it by continuing to supply Israel with weapons that they themselves believed were violations of were war crimes. So I think that's the biggest change that we're likely to see is the absence of that hypocrisy, but the practical result will be the same for Palestinians, and that is erasure and continued violations of their rights.
So you don't feel Trump will actually be, beyond rhetoric, that is, worse than the Biden administration?
He could end up being worse in the sense that he will allow Israel to do what it wants in both Gaza and the West Bank. At least under Biden, there were some constraints on Israel's conduct in the West Bank. The sanctions on settler terrorists, for example, was one limited example, and there were attempts there to try and stem the violence, but we're not likely to see that same approach from Donald Trump. And so, for the Israelis, they would have a green light in Gaza and in the West Bank, and of course, as I'm sure you know, the West Bank right now is under immense pressure. There's a total closure that Israel has imposed, as well as a massive military crackdown on all forms of resistance and even dissent in the West Bank.
And my last question now, looking forward to the future of Palestinian politics, West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, what do you see as being the sort of near future of Palestinian politics and what's going to happen there?
Yeah, I think sadly, Palestinian politics is in a state of disarray and dysfunction. The Palestinian leadership of Mahmoud Abbas and his Palestinian Authority has very, very little domestic legitimacy. President Abbas is extremely unpopular. He was unpopular before October 7th of 2023. And nowadays, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that he's hated by large segments of his own population. And the overwhelming majority of Palestinians would like to see him leave the scene. The problem is that Hamas doesn't offer much of a better alternative in terms of governance or national unity. And Hamas could end up being more radicalized after the events of the last 15 months. And so right now, Palestinians remain politically divided and dysfunctional, and that is contributing to the atrocities that are being committed against them. And so until there is a credible, cohesive, unitary Palestinian leadership, we're not likely to see any positive developments on the Palestinian scene. And who knows how long that could take.
Khaled Elgindy, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd missed this one and would like to catch up, you can go to our website, or if you would like to see previous conversations, also on our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.